I've noticed this disturbing trend amongst newer games coming out, especially in the last couple years, with notable releases like Jedi Survivor or Mortal Kombat 1 on the Nintendo Switch recently, and Cyberpunk 2077, that most of these games come out less than playable conditions, to say the least, and some of them famously are even worse than that. But I've been curious of why these games have been coming out like this. Because I remember back in the day with games like Halo 3, Lego Star Wars The Complete Saga, Black Ops on the Xbox 360 for a little bit more of a recent game in that bunch, would be substantially less buggy. So I started doing research and looking around, and this will be grossly simplified, and not to mention my obvious lack of game development expertise and experience in the industry. But from what I've gathered, this modern gaming predicament we find ourselves in today is down to a handful of problems, excluding any company-specific problems like rush development and games needing to come out at a certain time point and not having any other choice but to release like in something like that. For example, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, that game had to come out when it did, because this game not only is a new Pokemon game, but has merch, toys, plushies, new card games, new shows and movies being planned around this new game release. And it's not very often that Pokemon games are so buggy, but I feel like with this larger, take on the franchise, it did the scope did not meet the time restraints that they had. They should have definitely reeled back on some of their ideas, and this game probably would have been a much playable state when it released. But unfortunately, it didn't, but that didn't affect its sales. 20 million plus games sold for a shitty Pokemon game. It's shocking to see how well this game sold, in spite of how bad it was. For example, like back in the day, if Pokemon Ruby needed to be delayed, it very well could have, because it didn't. Pokemon isn't the monster that it is today. They could have delayed it. They could have delayed everything. Even back then, they could have done that, but they didn't, because the game was much smaller in scale and scope. They didn't need multiple years to develop it. Frankly, today a modern developer could have easily made Pokemon Ruby in like a week or a couple months or something like that. But that's neither here nor there. There just weren't as many bugs as there are today, back in the day. Sometimes it's not due to just a rushed timeline, but just poor development. I see poor management as a good case for Cyberpunk 2077. The constant shifting of goals in style and scope of the game, and just the staff burning out from crunch, is just, in the game overall being a mess, is probably why that game, and also not to mention that game had 10 years worth of development and it radically changing design multiple times. It could definitely affect the overall end product, and we sort of saw that. And we really didn't start seeing this fix-it-later mentality until really the end of the Xbox 360 generation and at the beginning of the Xbox One generation of consoles. Because at the beginning of the 360 generation, we saw the advent of online digital marketplaces where you could download updates or DLC or the whole game itself from the internet. It was 2007. This was the first time we could realistically do that. And really, it was amazing. Like, not the entire game back then was on the disc. You didn't need to download any updates. You didn't need any post-launch fixes or a re-release or anything like that. The entire game was done and packed, finished on the disc. You didn't need internet. You didn't need anything. You just put the game in. Boom, you're off to the races. But as the generation went on, we started to see developers start releasing more updates to their games, like fixing problems that they didn't know existed beforehand, balance changes, releasing DLC that had bugs, so they had to go back and fix it. So we slowly started to really see this, fixing it, developing the game as it was already out, adding more to it over time, fixing it, refining it with time. For example, towards the beginning of the Xbox One generation, there was Assassin's Creed Unity, one of the first major releases like of a giant open world on the Xbox One. And this game was famously just a disaster. Body part, it was the whole show, gabagoo, everything was just ruined, and the game was an absolute disaster. And looking back on it, like, you boot it up now, the game is really good. This game is not a buggy mess. This game is graphically beautiful still. The rendering of the Notre Dame being one of the most amazing things you could have seen at the time. And it's really interesting to see how this game really changed over time. And this isn't the only example of a game that got better with time. No Man's Sky, Fallout 76, all these games got better with time, but that's not necessarily a good thing. And a common problem amongst these games, as the games industry got bigger, the scale of the games got bigger, the worlds got bigger, but the amount of problems these games have now are just exponentially larger than they used to be. These games have so many problems that we've never encountered before during the development process, that these games now are taking longer and longer to fix because these problems are bigger and bigger and bigger every time they go and make a new game. And it's not even determined by like how big the developer is. Even tier 1 AAA developers like Rockstar, Naughty Dog, and Nintendo all have these same problems. Like, for example, how the hell did Rockstar release GTA Trilogy in such a deplorable state? Like, what the heck? It makes absolutely no sense why Rockstar let the game release in such a state. It is baffling and it's a problem. But some might say that's just because of greed. In that particular instance, I am inclined to believe the greed argument. But it is still just a massive problem. Some of you might be wondering, why didn't we have any major bugs back in the day? You know, like with Super Nintendo, GameCube, PS2, like any of the more classic game generations that in the past. The unfortunate fact is, due to these game systems, being easier in general to develop for, the scale of things aren't as large as they are today. Bugs like that, bugs in general, were far and fewer in between. And with the game not being able to be updated after the fact, definitely forced them to delay the game because they couldn't realistically fix it after the fact. So they had to go and fix these games. They had no choice to. Even in some games, when they did discover bugs, they found that they were fun. Stuff like, big heads in some games were like a cheat code. Most of these games back in the day had cheat codes, and some of their, some of the cheat codes came from bugs that they found. So they're like, you know what, this is really funny. Let's give them the bug, but, let's put in a coat of paint, make sure it doesn't happen randomly as a bug usually is, but let's make it official, tie it to a cheat code, and boom, you now have a new, fun, interesting thing you can do in the game. And stuff like that just doesn't happen in modern games anymore. But like, with games getting day one updates that are larger and larger and larger, some of you may be asking, why isn't that on the disc? Well, the discs get printed like months ahead of time, and they're still developing the game in the months leading up to the launch of the game. So these discs are full of data that is either old, outdated, or covered in bugs. So they release day one updates to fix and patch and update the game. So it's like, why does it have to be that way? Like, I can't figure out any reasonable way to fix those kinds of problems. And you can't even say that vote with your money, don't buy a shitty game or a buggy game. But that clearly hasn't paid off in any reasonable way. Because it's because we voted with our money that we're getting all sorts of microtransaction riddled buggy messes with post-launch updates in excess of hundreds of gigabytes. It's not like these companies don't know what they're doing. They know exactly what they're doing. They know the community hates this, and they know they're releasing a poor product. It's not like they don't know what they're doing. These people aren't stupid. I just think it's one of those more major problems in these business people getting involved with the game development process and overall poor management from the management teams, causing these games to either be rushed, buggy, or riddled with microtransactions. And this isn't meant to be pessimistic, but in terms of the current state of gaming, there is some hope to be had. There are fantastic indie developers releasing bug-free, fun games like Hades, Stardew Valley, even Minecraft, for what it's worth, even though it's not exactly indie anymore. It's relatively always been a relatively bug-free experience. Even major tier 1 developers with games like Baldur's Gate being as awesome as it is with having fewer bugs than the average game. Sure, there were some game-breaking bugs that would delete your save or undo a bunch of progress, but that was fixed in like the first week. And to my knowledge, there wasn't a massive day 1 update. But not every developer can do what Baldur's Gate 3 did. They almost went bankrupt multiple times because of making these games that they do. These nearly perfect games at launch nearly kill the company every time. And it's that risk that these companies are trying to avoid. They don't want every game to be make or break for their company. They don't want to end up with like something like Telltale's. That company literally imploded on itself because of the amount of projects that they were making. The amount of stuff that they were trying to do was just too much, and they just died. Not every company can let their developers have as much creative freedom, as much control with the final product. But we can only hope that sentiment changes with hopefully changing tides in the gaming industry with the release of Baldur's Gate 3. Not necessarily every game having to be as good as Baldur's Gate, but just trying to maintain some level of fun and creative intrigue in the development process with less influence from the business types and the corporate heads of the companies having less overall pressure on the dev team. Because once that pressure is released a little, we'll probably start seeing more impressive, better, prettier, cooler, and fun games. We need the power in the developers' hands with a nice guiding push from the management. We don't need them to be these all-powerful deities in these companies just demanding games come out when they do. So what are your thoughts? Do you think gaming is in a good spot right now, or is it even worse than I think it is? Leave a comment down below. I'd love to hear. Don't forget to comment and subscribe and like. And don't forget to make it a great day.